Hello and welcome. Today I have another episode of Pellam's Wasteland Reads, this time covering Games, Agency as Art by Thi Nguyen. I hope that pronunciation is at least close to correct. And this is a nonfiction philosophical discussion of games, not just in kind of terms of like game design, of which there are a number of books, but more in terms of, like I said, a philosophical discussion of an attempt to understand the nature of games, the value of games, a sort of different and really sophisticated way of thinking about games. And this is a book that when I finished it, I thought, wow, that was pretty interesting. And then since finishing it, I have continued to think about so many of the things that are brought up in this book over and over again. Just these different concepts that are discussed in here are really fascinating and interesting, and I think worthy of ruminating on, and totally worth checking out for anyone who is interested in the idea of trying to understand games philosophically. And what Nguyen puts forward as a philosophical understanding of the nature of games is this concept of layered agency, which is the idea that even though a person has all sorts of different kind of forms of agency, has different concepts of value, different goals that they have within a game space, there is a very specific agential structure that is provided by the game, that has to do with like how victory and defeat are defined, the rules of the game as providing a specific structure to engage with. And that this creates essentially a goal and a means of achieving that goal. And that part of what we do when we play games is we take on this goal temporarily. And that this helps to explain things like the idea of a stupid game, as Nguyen calls it, which is a stupid game is a game in which victory is ultimately meaningless and pointless, but it is necessary to act in the pursuit of victory in order to create the happening of the game. And so, there are a number of examples, but a lot of them, the idea is that, say, like drinking games are a really common example where you kind of have to be trying to win the drinking game in order for the stuff of the game to happen, but it is a pointless victory. There's no real, like, meaningful win from being able to beat your friends at a drinking game. And in fact, if anybody got particularly good at most drinking games, you would stop playing that one and play a different one, because the point is not for somebody to be good at a particular game, but to everybody to get drunk and have fun, basically. And so this layering of agency is used as an explanation for why this happens this way. Basically, the idea that this particular layering of agency allows for us to engage with a game like that and be meaningfully interested in victory, and then to disengage and no longer be meaningfully interested in victory. And that this also explains a lot of things, like, for instance, why a person could play a game and want to, a lot of other instances of wanting to win within the space of the game, but not wanting to do everything in their power to win outside of the space of the game. So an example used, Nguyen talks about playing board games with his wife, and this idea of them enjoying themselves when they are both at a very similar level of skill, and that if what ultimately mattered in the greater sense was winning at the game, it would make sense to try to do everything outside of the game to improve your chances of winning, to learn the game really well, and read up on strategy guides and all these different things. But that actually, what is fun is to be trying to win within the space of the game and not trying to gain any extra advantages outside of the game, because while the pursuit of victory within the space of the game is necessary to engage with the structure of the game itself, it is not an ultimate goal, an ultimate good for the individual. The individual's ultimate goal is to have fun with the game, and having fun with the game in this context requires being interested in victory when engaged with the game, and being uninterested in any sort of within game victory when outside of the space of the game. And so there's a lot of discussion on those terms. That's kind of the core concept. The book has 10 chapters, of which the first is basically an introduction and the last is basically a conclusion. And each of the chapters engages with a different element of this theory. So some of them are about various kind of different ideas of what games are. In other terms, engaging with other kind of theorists of games and the way that they have thought about the value of games, or the way that a person who is playing a game thinks about value, all of that sort of stuff. And all these kind of different expressions of this sort of core argument that has to do with the idea of games as being a means of engaging with a temporary agency, that in particular also, because it is temporary, allows us to experiment with agency and with value and with goals and all these different things. That in Nguyen's argument, this becomes an important way to think about the value of games. That one of the overriding values is that these in-game values are temporary, and so they allow us to think about essentially what it would be like to be concerned specifically with one set of values, or to think specifically about one type of abilities that are tied to a particular game or not tied to a particular game. This sense of the temporary nature of agency as allowing for a viewer of the game, a player of the game as art, to communicate something about our own agency when outside of the space of the game. Much in the way that, for instance, reading a novel allows us to kind of think about communication in words, or looking at a painting allows us to think about the nature of sight and vision, and use of color, and all these different things. All of the ways in which art matters to us outside of the limited space of directly engaging with art, and that games have a very kind of specific way of being meaningful to us in that sense. And then on the other side, there is a lot about kind of why games become so desirable. And this is one of the other things that Nguyen talks about, is this idea of value clarity. That in real life, most of us have a great many different competing values, a great many different goals that we would like to move towards, but often they are partially or completely exclusive with each other. There is a real need to balance all of these things that we care about and want to work towards and spend our time on, and all that sort of stuff. And that one of the things that games provide, and one of the reasons in this argument that games are pleasurable to engage with, is because they provide this value clarity, this idea that within the space of the game, this complex interrelationship of a number of different priorities is either kind of compressed down to a single value, or it is compressed into a number of commensurate values. So the idea of like in a game that has multiple kind of paths to victory, even in that case, there is some means by which the different paths to victory are interrelated, right? So to use like a Civilization as a video game series, right? That there's a military victory and cultural victory and science victory and all these different victories. All of them are different means of getting to the end, but there's sort of one ultimate goal that is achieving one of the different victories, and here's a set of kind of competing ways to get there, but the kind of ultimate value still fits this idea of kind of value clarity. And that in a lot of ways ends up tying into what I think is probably the best part of this book, which is right near the end. There is a discussion not so much of games themselves, but of this concept of gamification, the ways in which the controls that are innate to designing games, and this idea of providing abilities and goals as related to game design, what happens when that is applied to other elements of real life. And so there are examples used of various different kind of means of gamification, especially in like corporate spaces and structures, and the idea of how to identify specific, or how different individuals or organizations have identified specific goals and kind of introduce these structures to try to encourage specific behaviors, and the real danger of the ways in which value clarity in games is so appealing, but in real life takes something away from our own really remarkable ability to manage all of these different priorities and values and all these different things. And that there is something very nefarious in the way that value clarity can be so kind of deeply appealing in the face of complexity, and that there's something kind of potentially very, very dangerous and very vulnerable to manipulation in that, which is, I think, it's a really interesting kind of part of this sort of arc of this particular book, to go from talking about the nature of games to the nature of all of the things that are not games, and how they are altered through the logic of games, which is really cool. It's a really neat and thought-provoking last kind of main chapter of this particular book. So anyway, that's basically the whole thing. Games, Agency as Art, a really cool and good book for people who are interested in thinking deeply about the nature of games. A lot of stuff about board games and video games and drinking games and all sorts of different games. Some really great, like a lot of academic sources, a great resource for anyone who is interested in delving deeper into this kind of discussion, because there are so many different works cited, all of these different other sources that are available, or are pointed out in this particular book to make it easier to get into this discussion. If you find that you really like this philosophical discussion of games, this is, I think, a good place to start, and has a lot of information about other places to go. Anyway, yeah, really a book that I have thought a lot about ever since I finished it, and that I think is definitely worth reading and thinking about yourself. So yeah, that is going to be that. So if you have read Games, Agency as Art, or if you have any thoughts about it or whatever else, leave a comment down below. Otherwise, I've been live from Pellam's Wasteland, and I will see you next time. Take care, everybody.